So we wanted to welcome everyone to the last grand rounds of the year before graduation. Today we have a special guest, Ryan Lee, is coming down to visit us from Oregon Health Sciences University. Ryan did his undergrad at Brown, did his med school at Pittsburgh, was at residency at Hopkins, and then he was thankfully came here to be our first microvascular fellow back in 2014. So he'll always have a special place in our hearts. I think he knows many of you, and it's kind of funny to have the trainees all have not been here when you were a fellow. So it's
Full
must feel
cycle,
like a
right?
different place. Yeah. No, Ryan's done a lot of great work up at OHSU where he's been since graduation. He's become a real leader in robotic surgery and single port surgery, particularly after training under Chris Holsinger. Really took the lead on that new technology and is running courses now and pretty well known across the country and the world in that area. He also recently completed his MBA. Spent the last 3 years doing that, and he has a lovely wife, Miriam, who's a facial plastic surgeon up there, and our new daughter, Ava, who's about a year old. And so, yeah, we're super excited to have Ryan. He's going to be talking about something very near and dear to many of us, which is financial toxicity, big problem with cancer treatment, and modeling the economic impact of head and neck cancer treatment. So, thank you, Ryan.
Okay. Thanks, Vasu. All right. I've been threatened by my wife if I try to get any more degrees. It's the couch. Yeah. So I can't tell how many people are on Zoom, but we have a small group. So interrupt anytime you like. I'd love to talk about this more. 23? Okay, great. Oh, great. I'm going to churn through a couple slides pretty quickly at the beginning so we can spend more time closer to the end just discussing this concept. A lot of this was born out of some of the projects that I did during my MBA program, which is a 3-year program. And every summer we had a capstone project. And one year I just started to get a handle on some of these publicly available databases that look at financial welfare of individual households in the US and try to extrapolate some of this really robust data to head and neck cancer. Okay, so let's get started. No disclosures that are relevant to this talk today. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about today, the first objective, is discussing at a model level, just hypothetical level, what is the economic impact to head and neck cancer patients when they're treated with a typical head and neck cancer treatment course. This usually involves surgery or radiation. If it involves surgery, sometimes it's followed a month and a half later if we're on time with radiation therapy or radiation and chemotherapy. And again, I'm using some of these federal databases that have nothing to do with head and neck cancer because they've got a lot of data and we can extrapolate from that data back to our context. The second thing we'll talk about is modeling what it looks like to protect people from income loss. Okay, and this was born again out of another MBA project that I did last year. Trying to learn the concepts of insurance, the driest topic in the world, but actually turns out to be really interesting, trying to figure out how to calculate risk of individuals who are at risk of losing their income. Okay, so we'll talk about both of those things. As a background, so every year the Federal Reserve, the US Federal Reserve, publishes a survey of over 12,000 respondents that are supposed to represent the population of the United States. It's pretty well distributed. I chose 2019's database. They have a 2020 and a 2021 because I wanted to look at something more stable than what's gone on, of course, during the pandemic. And just kind of, it's a little bit cleaner data and it doesn't factor in some hopefully transient external influences. So it was about 12,000 household respondents. They asked lots of questions about take-home income, student loans, medical expenses, credit card bills, credit card debt, burden of debt, and most importantly, housing expenses, so rent and housing, rent and mortgage. In their summary, there's a couple take-home points here, and it depends how you look at the data and how you analyze the data, how this is interpreted. But one of the important data points is that 16% of households in this report are not able to service their monthly debt. Okay, they can't pay their monthly expenses in full, and 28% would be unable to pay their current month's expenses, cover their expenses, if the expenses increase by $400. We chose $400 as their stress test, so to speak. So a little more background from this survey. So 63% of adults, they could pay off their expenses in full using cash or credit, okay, and pay off the credit card by the end of the month, which is interesting. That means that short-term cash flow might be tight, but they can catch up by the end of the month. Okay, that's an improvement over 2018, a year earlier. And then 25% of patients or of persons responding to these surveys declined to receive medical care because they're concerned about the cost. Okay, so this is all self-reported. 22% incurred an unexpected major medical expense, not surprising, and 18% had unpaid debt related to medical expenses for themselves or their family. Okay, so some of the other reported data from this survey talk about the subjectivity. How do people feel in terms of their financial stability, depending on what their take-home income is. Okay, so in 2019, if you earn less than $40,000, respondents to the survey, about 55% of them said that they felt like they're doing okay financially, and intuitively, you can intuit as you take home more income, you feel more financially stable. It went up to 95% feeling comfortable with their economic status if they earned over $100,000. So now let's link this back to our context a little bit. There is a study about 3 years ago that looked at oropharyngeal cancer patients. I think this is out of Denmark, if I remember correctly. About almost 300 patients. A decent majority of these were HPV-associated cancers, with some statuses unknown. And they basically looked at working status, return to work. Okay. Most of these patients were working prior to treatment. Some of them were not, either retired or not participating in the workforce. So the time point that they chose to look at was 15 months after treatment had completed. Okay, and 72% of people returned to work. Doesn't mean that the other 28% all intended to go back to work and were unable to. There's lots of caveats to that, right? But one of the important take homes from this was that when you look that far out, about a year and a half, you start to wonder what's happening in that first year after treatment was completed, right? Because that's a long period of time where income loss really can impact the financial welfare of individual households. It's probably a little bit different in a very socialized country, socialistic environment such as in Denmark, but just for some perspective. How do we assess financial welfare? There's a lot of lenses and a lot of stakeholders here, right? One is looking at the payer and what costs are incurred in their organizations, the health system, the expenditures to the health system, and how they're reimbursed. And then, of course, the topic that I was interested in is the household of patients. One way to think about this is that health insurance now is commonplace for our patients. In Oregon, about 3% of patients are not insured amongst our head and neck cancer population. Okay? Small percentage, right? So the issue is not so much, do they have medical insurance? Are their medical expenses in large part covered, even though they pay some out of pocket? It's what do they do with the rest of their expenses when they're not working and they've lost income? Okay, so the model that we were trying to create here is a really simple model conceptually on the clinical side. It's let's subject every household from this survey to the same stress test of undergoing a standard cancer treatment for head and neck cancer. So I said a minimum time off of work of 3 months. Okay? And it's not across the board that every patient is off work for 3 months, but assume for the purposes of the study, that's the exposure. They have their surgery, they convalesce, and then a month and a half later, they undergo adjuvant therapy, and 3 months later, they're finished, and it takes a few months to recover physically. Okay. So again, using this data, it's called the Survey on Household Economics and Decision Making, the SHED data. Okay, and it's publicly available, easy to look at. It's all in an Excel format, and surprisingly easy to access and try to analyze. It's really well laid out, and it has some limitations, which I'll talk about. So I was looking. I excluded patients that were younger than 35 years of age because it's fairly uncommon to develop a head and neck cancer in that group. But the fun part of this was putting together a set of financial statements for every patient. Again, just doing this through Excel and Stata and just collating all of the data that they have on monthly expenses for these patients or for these respondents and what's their monthly take-home income. The most tedious part of all of this is figuring out how much take-home income do they really have, because all they publish is gross income, pre-tax income. So you have to calculate their federal income tax rate, which is, as you know, is a progressive tax. So you have to go through step by step, breaking down their gross income into actual cash inflows into their house. And same thing with state income tax. So the first test. Now let's go through this, the stress test, and see what is the impact of 3 months of lost income first. So the first stress test is no income for 3 months. The second stress test is to simulate a 50% reduction in income, either because they continue to work part-time or they have some sort of disability or social safety net program that is protecting at least a portion of their income. It's hard, it's a little bit far-fetched to expect a current social safety net program to protect even 50% of most incomes. But sometimes on top of some disability insurance that's available through employers, you can get there. Okay. Whoops. And then the same stress tests in point A and point B are applied in the situation where these respondents can tap into their retirement savings. Okay, because so in the first two scenarios, we're not depending at all on any savings that they have. And one of the data points that's reported out in this survey is how much do you have saved for retirement? It doesn't say if it's liquid, it doesn't say if they can access it easily, but in scenario C, we're going to assume that they can. Okay, so there's some big limitations to this survey, and that's why I started to look at another database after this study. One of the limitations is that the most important piece of the expense side is housing, and they have available data on how much do you pay for rent monthly, and they have data on whether you pay for a mortgage as well, or do you own your house outright. Okay, they have data on student loans, and they have data on medical expenses, but they don't have the classic basket of goods that you can get from other databases, which I'll talk about later. So this is kind of like the bare minimum first approximation of whether somebody can weather the storm of losing their income for 3 months. Can they pay for housing to keep a roof over their head? Okay. In terms of, I'm going to skip a little bit of this. In terms of cash flow, even from the starting point, before we do these stress tests, there's a small percentage of U.S. households that are already underwater. They're already in the red, and they're not able to service their monthly debts. Okay, I'll show you in a moment. So I'll talk about some of these limitations here. So I'm going to show you some of the results first of the baseline status. So this is before I've subjected them to any stress test. All you have to look to is the red outlined areas here. Let me see if I can point for you. So the top line is looking at the average age, the mean age and the median age. So left side is mean age, right side is median age of those respondents who are already in negative cash flow to begin with. Okay, they already can't pay all of their expenses by month before we've even stressed them. Okay, I think we'll skip the rest of this because it'll become more clear on the next few slides. So of the original 12,100 odd survey respondents, about 9,400 of them are ages 35 or over. So that's the group that I used for our little simulation. As I said, about 2% of them have negative cash flow at baseline. You can imagine, in reality, in the United States, there's probably more than 2% of US households who can't service their debts. And again, the limitation with this survey is because it primarily focuses on housing expenses, which usually makes up estimates 20 to 40% of monthly expenses for individual households. So it doesn't account for the other half. So again, it's a first approximation, and we'll make it a little cleaner in a couple of slides. So the first stress test, as I discussed earlier, is we tax their gross income. We impart a 7% state income tax. We figure out how much income they're actually bringing home every month, and then we take away that income for 3 months straight, and see if they can service their expenses, their debts. Okay, no disability, no social security safety net. So at baseline, as I mentioned before, 2% of households are insolvent. The way you can look at this graph is the x-axis is just the individual subjects, the individual respondents. Okay, not as important, but on the y-axis, this is their monthly cash flow. So the 0 point you can see here, if they're below that line, that means they're already in the negative. And above that, they're in the positive. So the majority of households are net positive in this scenario. Take away 1 month of income, and about 7.5% of these households are insolvent. If you take away 2 months of income, keep expenses the same, then 16.4% are insolvent. And then if you take away 3 months worth, then about a quarter of US households are insolvent. Again, in a very conservative model already, where they probably have another 50% more expenses at least than what we're accounting for in this study. Okay, so how do you interpret this? Net monthly, negative monthly cash flow means that you can't pay for even housing, okay, in this scenario. If you can't pay for housing, then you probably are struggling to pay for other important goods and services, food, electricity, all the other utilities. At 6 months, if you carry this forward even further, 50% of US households are insolvent. They don't have enough in terms of their current cash flow, not talking about savings, but cash flow, in order to service their monthly expenses. That gets a little scary at 6 months. So stress test number 2, same tax situation, same take-home income, until we take away about half of that income, or we take away half of the income again for 3 months, okay? And it's meant to simulate, do you have some sort of disability coverage or some sort of social safety net benefit? And then this is what it looks like. Again, at baseline, before any stressor, 2% are insolvent, 14.5% are insolvent after 1 month. Again, 16.4% are insolvent after 2 months. And then actually it doesn't change much. If by rounding error, it's about the same after 3 months, okay? So not quite the same severity as the prior scenario where a quarter of US households were insolvent. So how do you interpret this? If you carry this forward 6 months, again, about 21% of US households are insolvent. They can't pay their debts. So the last stress test is tapping into savings, okay? And again, there's no data to explain how liquid these savings are. So sometimes these are not necessarily liquidable overnight, right? For households that need rapid cash. So if you take into account savings in the United States, actually the insolvency rate goes down a lot. Okay, so if you can liquidate savings, about 3% of households are insolvent at 3 months. Seems like a rosier picture, right? Again, in this approximate model. And then at 6 months, 6% are insolvent. Okay, looks a little better. So in other words, the take-home message there is there are actually a sizable portion of U.S. households, more than I expected, that actually have considerable savings. It's just a question of, can you actually tap into those to help you weather the storm? And it's not clear that that's the case. So to get a little bit more of an expense basket, the basket of costs per month, another great source of data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They publish the Consumer Price Index and various variations of this index, which try to compile as accurately as possible the typical basket of goods, the typical items that people spend money on every month. Okay, and you can run the same financial stress test. They also report out take-home income, and we can use that. So in a similar type of stress, they break down their respondents into those in manufacturing sectors, in government sectors, and what they call professional sectors, which is not, professional is not the same, used the same way that we use it as physician, lawyer, engineer. It's a much more broad category than that. So anyways, in a base scenario where someone doesn't have cancer, okay, on the left side here, in the manufacturing sector, which is mostly factory jobs, a lot of blue collar work, over time, they are expected to accumulate cash, okay, on average. This is on average every month. If the line is going up, the y-axis is the cash inflows, the cash excess above 0 for an individual household. These are averages. If you give them a cancer diagnosis and start the same cancer treatment that I discussed on the other slides in June, okay, By the middle of July, many of these households are insolvent. This is on average. By the time you get to December, okay, so 6 months after treatment, on average, everybody is insolvent at that point. So pretty similar to the prior data, but the rate of insolvency starts earlier. Okay, it begins earlier. It usually begins about a month and a half into their treatment. Okay, the same thing for professionals, the professional sector. Same thing. Yeah, again, 6 months into the calendar year, they get a cancer diagnosis, they get their treatment, and about a month and a half into treatment, on average, patients are reaching that insolvency line. Okay. Um, and then the same thing goes for the government sectors as well, about a month and a half to 2 months after treatment begins. Okay. So this is, in some ways, this data is a little more accurate, a little more telling than the prior federal database. It's just that that database is a lot easier to work with and has cleaner income data. This one's a little harder to calculate. But in any case, this creates a larger basket of expenses, and so you would expect people to be insolvent earlier. Okay. If you're curious, this is the basket that they look at. Some of these things I think, well, how much do I spend on haircuts? Quite a bit, actually. Funeral expenses, hopefully not much, but there's a lot of basic things: cable, electricity, household bills, airfare, gasoline, things that you would expect to be in a typical monthly expenditure. Okay. So again, in a nutshell, to interpret this data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, on average, U.S. households will be insolvent about a month to a month and a half after they start treatment, if they've lost their income entirely. Okay. So in conclusion here, and sadly for you guys, there's still more to come, but this is a conclusion for the first part of the talk. The past decade has brought a significant number of people, as we know, to have medical insurance coverage, right? The ACA did that for us, about 20 million more insured than prior to the ACA being instituted. So, but the economic stress of a major healthcare event nowadays we can think of as beyond the walls of hospitals and medical expenses. It's really for everything else that is important in life and that costs money. So the one thing that we didn't study during this project that I didn't study was credit and how much you can kick the can down the road by using credit to pay off debts. But the reality is you can't use credit cards in general, at least I don't know how to pay for housing. And so it's kind of irrelevant, at least to the first model. Okay. So what can you do here? You could incentivize household saving. I think that's not easy to do. You're talking about trying to change a population-wide behavior of probably insufficient saving, right? There's you probably all heard of this 3 to 6 month saving rule. Have that under your bed to protect you for a rainy day, right? Might be the reality that you need more than that for serious events like a head and neck cancer diagnosis or any other major medical illness that's going to cause some disability. Okay, so the last thing is what I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the last part of this talk, which is expansion of disability insurance. Okay, and whether that's a private sector responsibility or public. Let me just model it out for you so you can see what it looks like relative to other major expenditures that the federal government invests in to protect its citizens. Okay, so for some context, most of you probably have disability insurance. I have it. I have my own occupation disability insurance. It costs probably a few $1,000s a year. It's not cheap, but it guarantees me in the event that I become disabled and unable to work, the majority of my income. Not all of it, but the majority, right? And after tax money too. I was curious whether historically insurance companies had ever tried to form an insurance market for the rest of the population. You know, for a relatively high income population that's willing to pay it, especially occupation specific insurance, that's easier to do. You know, we participate in that market. But for the general population that has a huge range of income stability, that's a more difficult sell, right? One of the things that I found interesting is just philosophically thinking about the difference between a rational economic choice that an economist might talk about. You know, the numbers make sense. This is what you should do. This is a decision you should make. If you're risk averse, if you want certainty about your future financial welfare, versus what people do in real life, including myself, right? Which is often different and factors in many more considerations that you can't put to numbers and to math. So this is the classic economy 101 risk averse investor diagram. This is a logarithmic plot where utility on the y-axis means, you can kind of think of it as how happy am I with my current financial situation, and on the x-axis is your actual wealth, your financial situation. Okay, this is called a risk averse investor. This is what the curve looks like. As your wealth increases, your utility, your happiness increases. This is the blue line, right? But we call this diminishing returns because over time, for every incremental gain in wealth, you don't get the same increase in happiness over time. At some point, you kind of max out, right? Whether you have $1 million, whether you have $1.5 million, it might not make a big difference at some point. Okay, so here's an example of what I mean. Think if you start with $200,000 of wealth. That's what you have in the bank in a healthy state. And let's say you become sick and disabled, and your wealth drops to $100,000 because you can't work. Okay, and let's say you are not a healthy person, and the probability of being in the healthy state for you is only 50%, and the probability of being in the unhealthy state is 50%. This is very high, right? So the simple way conceptually that insurance companies think about, how do I calculate a premium? If I'm trying to sell this person insurance to protect their income, offer them a product, how would I calculate a fair premium? Because they have a high probability in this scenario of becoming disabled and me having to pay out, right? And the payout would be not $50,000, it would be $100,000, because if this person becomes disabled, they only have $100,000. They want $100,000 back to get back to their original state of wealth. Okay, in a simple example. So what they do is a really simple weighted average of the probabilities of these different wealth states. So if you have a 50% probability of having $200,000 and a 50% probability of having $100,000, if you add those together, the expected wealth is $150,000. That's how they look at a potential customer, right? And that person will never have $150,000. They'll either be at 200 or they'll be at 100. Right? But this is the average. So what's the fair premium to expect a customer to pay? It's $50,000, because on average you would expect a person to have $150,000 in the bank and expect $50,000 back. Even though in reality the insurance company may have to pay out $100,000. This doesn't work on a one-to-one basis. Like if you have one customer, which would be a very bad business model, then you can't do this, right? Because you're either gonna go defunct, or you're gonna be fine and make 50 grand, right? So then let's do a little show of hands, since I'm probably putting everybody to sleep. Who would be willing to pay, if you're in this state and you know you have a 50% probability of becoming disabled, who would be willing to pay $50,000 right now? And have $150,000 in the bank, but be guaranteed if you become disabled, the insurance company will pay you your money to protect your income. Anyone? Yep, lump sum. Any hands? You got a 50% chance. Assume this is a 1-year scenario. Yeah, because it gets complicated as you go forward. Yeah, and you have to pay. Yeah, if you start 1 year. Part of the problem is, like, who knows that they have a 50% chance, right? Some people do, in really dire, with dire medical comorbidities, but most of us don't, right? So it's hard to pull that trigger, right? And that's a lot of money to spend, but you're guaranteed. You know what you will have, in the bank, no matter what. But it costs you quite a bit of money. Okay, I'll move on. Yeah. Exactly. Yep, you lose that 50,000, but you guarantee that if you become disabled and you fall to 100,000, they'll give you your money back. They'll pay you back, but you have to pay up front and gamble that 50% of the time people never need to execute that benefit, right? They never need to claim that. So it's tough, right? It's a fun mental exercise because you can play with any probability and see where people start to change their mind. Since nobody raised their hands, including myself, we'll move on. So the Social Security Disability Administration has some great estimates of how frequently do people become disabled over a certain time span. So in their database, they estimate that 1 in 4 individuals will become disabled at some point between the ages of 20 and 65. If you look at a cross section of the U.S. population, okay, meaning that from ages 20 to 65, 1 in 4 people over that time period are going to be disabled. And the definition of disability is pretty strict for Social Security. You have to be unable to work, fully disabled, unable to work, earn any income for 1 year. So it's a 1 year period that they look at. Okay. So what I thought of doing was figuring out how can we model an insurance program for all U.S. Households, where we can determine with relative accuracy how much risk they have of becoming disabled based on their age. Okay, so just based on age. So I broke these ages into 3 categories that we were interested in: so 35 to 44, 45 to 54, and 55 to 64. So that probability, 25% probability of people becoming disabled in those time periods, you can break that down, but you can't just divide it into 3 categories or say, the older group has a higher risk of having disability, even though that's true. You have to convert the probability to a log scale, which is some silly math that actually works out really well anytime you're in a situation where risk compounds. Okay, this is the identical formula that is used for the law of compounding interest, which I found like really interesting. Risk. If you're say 20 years old and you don't get sick, okay, so you survive a year without becoming disabled, you're part of that survivor pool, which is a smaller pool than at the beginning of the year. And every year the pool gets a little bit smaller, healthy people, and the risk gets a little higher and a little higher. And it's actually the same concept as compounding interest, except in the opposite direction. Instead of gaining, you're losing people, you're losing money. Okay. The bottom line is you can split this risk over these different age brackets, and I did it just kind of intuiting, what's the relative risk based on these ages. And of course, the older people are, the more likely they are to experience disability. Okay. And then with a little bit of number crunching, you can get back to what's the probability of surviving this age group, healthy, not being disabled. And it turns out in this model, about 97% of respondents ages 34 to 44 would be healthy. The other small percentage would be disabled. And then it goes down a little bit to 92%. And then by the time you get to 55 to 64, 83.5% of U.S. households would be, or U.S. Respondents would be disabled. Okay, I think that's a pretty reasonable intuition. There's no fancy math behind those numbers. Okay, and then from this data, that's actually all you need. This plus the income data that we have from these other databases to calculate how much should each household pay. What kind of insurance premiums should they pay every year in order to protect their entire income, their full income. Okay, so I just by random I pulled one of the respondents out of the Federal Reserve database. This person has a take-home income of about $49,000 after tax. Okay, they are ages 45 to 54 in that bracket. So their wealth at baseline is as we said, 45 to 74. The probability based on their age of being healthy is 92.3%. The probability of losing it all, if they lose their job and they become disabled, they lose all of their income. You can either set that to 0 because they have no income, or you can say, well, we do actually have a social safety net nationally, and you can say they'll claim an average benefit of about $12,000. And I pulled that from the Social Security Administration website just as a rough estimate of on average how much do people collect. And the probability for them of being in that disabled state is about 7.7%. Okay. From these numbers, you can calculate what's their, again, a weighted average of what kind of wealth they will have, which means not a real number of what they'll have. They'll either have all their wealth or they'll have none of it. But when insurance companies look at them, say what they should actually pay is this amount, $3,788 a year. Okay, that means take that away from their after-tax income, and guarantee them that if they go to zero in terms of their earning potential, you'll bring them back up to their 49,274. So more on this later. That's a lot of money, right? That's a big sum of money. Okay, so then if you scale that up to everybody, okay, in the survey, and then from the survey scale it up to the entire adult population, ages 35 to 64, how much does it cost? It costs, without, if there's no social security disability insurance, which there is right now, but if there isn't, the expenditure annually is $671 billion. Okay, so don't pay attention to the absolute number yet, because you have to think of it relative to other expenditures, other opportunities. If there's social security disability, then it's a little bit lower, about 568 billion. Okay. So how to interpret this? One thing is you need full participation of the entire population in order to make this model work. Again, the smaller the pool, typically the higher the risk, right? It's the same thing as adverse selection in health insurance, and you don't get the population that has low risk. You get the population that is most likely to submit a claim, right? For comparison, Social Security disability insurance, part of the Social Security Administration, pays out about $1.05 trillion a year as of 2020 in benefits to U.S. Citizens. So, and that's on about $1.06 trillion in revenue that they collect for the year. Okay, and they have a decent amount of reserves, but it's starting to go down. So this model that we have, if you go back for a moment, says that we could spend $671 billion to protect income completely, not the average payout of $12,000 to $20,000 that Social Security provides. Okay, so at about if we were to, not proposing this by the way, but if we were to drop Social Security contributions for disability, not for pension, to drop it to zero, our contributions to that, as a whole in aggregate, the U.S. population could spend less money and actually get more protection for their income on an annual basis. Okay, hope that makes some sense. So that's my last slide of commentary, but to me, that's the most important take-home message, is that there is a big inefficiency in our current safety nets. There's a big need. Of course, it's not going to be 50% of US populations that become disabled at once, right? But it's the same argument as with health insurance when we're arguing across the table for universal health insurance versus everyone has a right to choose. If you don't pool the risk of low risk and high risk, you cannot make a real socially protective service work. Right? The math will never work out. To which my little baby replies, "What are you talking about, Dad?" This is when we were in Mexico 2 weeks ago, and this is little baby Ava. I always show these slides. This is her excited when I start my talk. This is her terrified about what I'm talking about, and this is 30 seconds later. Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. Any questions? Yeah, Dimitri.
Okay, so you told us that SSDI paid out about $1 trillion, but you didn't tell me how much they charged that number of people to do that.
That's a great question.
How much did that same population pay into SSDI that year?
Let me pull it up for you. I have the percentages, but I don't have the absolute numbers. I can look it up while we talk. Do you have a follow up to that?
Well, I mean, my point is you're claiming that this would be more efficient.
Yeah.
And I say maybe.
Maybe
when you start administrating that and start having wealthy insurance company executives taking a lot of it, then it becomes, you're talking about a clean number where there's no administrative costs.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
I mean, in a sense, what you're arguing is for expanded, cheap, more efficient SSDI.
Hmm. And a larger risk pool too. For
Larger risk pool because you're socialist, which is great.
which I'm not really. But now I'm like thinking, maybe I am. I didn't even know it. Yeah. So the tax rate for Social Security, but this actually includes supplemental income too, to be fair. But the employee pays 7.65% of their gross income as of 2021. It's pretty high. And there's a cap on it. If you earn more than $140,000, you don't pay more.
Right, but that includes your retirement too,
Yeah,
right?
that includes retirement, to be fair. Yeah. Hopefully not your only retirement, but yes.
And I think the other sort of provocative question, and I'll throw it out, let's see if
Yeah.
I can get some people mad and yelling back at me or something, is, yeah, we spend too much. So I'm going to tell you a story about residents.
Okay.
Residents whinging about, we don't get paid enough, Jesus, all this debt we have to pay, it's outrageous. And then I go to a parking lot and I see Audis, BMWs, Acuras, right? Like, we're not saving. We're inadequately saving. We're a consumptive society, and this is well beyond this one wedge of the pie problem. We spend beyond what we should, and we save far less than we should. Because as you pointed out, stop me if I'm wrong, when you dip into your savings, this only becomes a 6% problem.
I agree.
Right.
If you have savings, you are largely protected from.
Right.
From
So I'm going to run home, sell my house, and live in one of those RVs on LP.
Nah.
Come visit.
They'll find a way to make that expensive too.
Brian, do you have separate disability insurance from what OHSU provides?
I do, yeah. So we got suckered into buying it while we were residents. I don't know if they do that here.
I had it for a while, for a long time.
So I bought a separate policy. Miriam has a separate policy. Every year we adjust it a little bit, and we bought separate life insurance policies. So OHSU, their coverage would be sufficient for. It's almost nominal. It's a small amount of coverage relative to our income, right? And so.
Well, I can think of 3 patients in the last week for whom these data explain a delayed regional recurrence after a really straightforward glossectomy, a 6-month delay in a simple TORS excision of a premalignant lesion. I mean, what was the motivation for you to study this? I mean, this seems totally unrelated to what you do as head and neck surgeon, but yet it impacts so many of the patients we see every day. I'm curious what your origin story is.
Part of it is anecdotal. Is the same situation. You know, having patients. Portland is a city, but the majority of our patients come from the rural areas of Oregon, very low on the income, quartiles or quantiles, and I've seen a couple patients lose their small businesses, seen patients lose their homes. It's not uncommon, right? It's very common. And then and that plus nerding out a little bit during some of my insurance economics classes made me realize there's actually a lot of relevance to what I'm learning and how it can be applied to our patients. But the beauty of it is that it can be applied to most of medicine, right, and most of health, because we're just a small piece of a large burden. Yep.
So I think the other question is, you talk about that person who bounces between 200 grand and 100 grand. And in the real world, you don't starve to death on 100 grand. And so the model you propose, on average, is a wash, right? Well, maybe I'll be, and 50% of the people that don't buy the insurance will come out better, and 50 will come out worse. But the problem is when you start to get lower and lower, then that lower number becomes unlivable.
You have less discretionary income.
Well, like when you can't pay the rent, at a certain point, you're in a shelter rather than your apartment.
Yeah.
So here's the provocative. You're saying, oh, everyone should buy insurance. But haven't you just told us as human beings we're irrational and not going to buy insurance? And so look, there's another government solution here. Raise taxes to fully cover us.
Now we're done.
So easy. Well, and getting back to that example of the person who is bringing home $49,000 a year, would they really be willing to pay, $3,000 or $3,500?
Huge, right?
Huge sum of money, right? Even if it makes sense on paper, it doesn't make sense in their day to day, right? Because you're asking them to prepare for a future disaster that is very unlikely to happen. I thought one of the solutions to that is to refund as a tax refund, some sort of federal refund the following year. You can't refund the entire proceed, but if this is a annual participation, you pay a premium every year, and you don't have to make a claim. There's probably a way to make the math work out where you can actually get some of that refunded back to you the next year, right? But then that means a year, that money's not worth as much a year later.
Right.
Ryan, is there any back here? Is there any data on countries that have national health insurance or just healthcare?
Yeah.
Are the rates of disability lower than they are in the U.S.
in terms of claims?
Yeah,
that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. So are you asking? Are the number of claims that are submitted less in those?
Yeah,
those
and
countries?
and people who define themselves as disabled, if there's no incentive from a standpoint of collecting a check that would pay for whatever,
sure,
whether it's going to healthcare in actuality or whether it's going to pay for other things with your cost of living. I just wonder.
Yeah.
Because one of the arguments, like the people who, I guess that you said that the rules are pretty strict from Social Security as to
but you're right.
how you get defined as disabled. But there's the question of
moral hazard and what people actually decide to do.
I had the same question as Lisa, and in our system, especially at the VA, the rate of the incidence of symptoms increase right before your disability needs to be reevaluated.
Sure.
There's a direct correlation there.
Yeah. So, or at least the doctor hears about them, right?
Yeah. So I think Lisa's question is really, really valid here.
Sure.
And maybe we are setting up a system where, we may not be encouraging and
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of arguments about what's the percent of people that actually probably abuse is too strong of a word, that type of a protective service, and I think by all, or not by all accounts, but by many accounts, it's quite low. It's single digit percentages is what people estimate, but I can't say more than that. Yeah, I haven't really dug into it any deeper. What were you gonna say?
I would say thanks. That was a great talk. I mean, I think it brings up a really interesting topic. I really don't think most of us can really understand what it means to live on the edge.
Yeah,
you're describing, and that level of uncertainty economically. I mean, most physicians come from more wealthy families. As soon as we finish training, even from residency on, there's a lot of guaranteed income, a lot of guaranteed future income, and you just think about the patients that break down in your clinic crying. I mean, all of us have had this where they start crying and they know that they can't go back to work.
Yep.
And the other thing with head and neck, I mean, the number of people who can go back to work but can't go back to their regular job. People in sales, there's all sorts of issues. And so I just think it's interesting. It's hard because as physicians, I don't think we can really understand this, to be honest. I think that we've insulated ourselves from what it feels like to be that group.
It's hard to think about yet another thing.
I'm not saying it's like we should, but I'm just saying it's interesting because we're at the interface. We're the face of it in a way when we're signing our patients up for extra scans and extra biopsies and all this stuff, chasing down things. And gosh, why didn't you come in for your recurrence? There's like this, but yet we can't even imagine what it'd be like to decide between like feeding your kids and having your
Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk alone could solve this whole thing.
Well, but that's actually going back to economics 101, your slide, right? So everything intelligent I Google on the internet unreferenced. So this is unreferenced. So you were like, everyone, when you ask them like, how much is enough for you? It's like 1.4x what they're making now. Right? And when you look at the behavior of people like us who are quite honestly incredibly flush in money, even this lowly medical oncologist in this surgery room. You know, I mean, we always feel like, oh yeah, I'd be better if I were making a little bit more. And that pushes up to, you know, the mega wealthy too. So in a sense, that utility curve, it seems like you don't need the 1,000th loaf of bread.
Sure.
People behave as if they do. People still grab for it.
Yeah. It's a little bit of an addiction. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to see what you do with this.
Well, we'll see. Yeah. Thanks.